They told us the great ocean was a graveyard, a one-way door into oblivion. They were wrong. Before the chains, there were charts. Before the plantations, there were palaces. This is the story of a man who carried the library of Timbuktu in his mind and the fire of a new world revolution in his heart. History says he was a slave. The stars knew him as a king. Chapter 1. The Golden Dust of Mali, 1750s. The sun over Timbuktu did not merely shine, it ruled. In the year 1755, the city remained a jewel of the Sahel, though the glory of the great Mansa Musa was a fading echo in the wind. For young Kalu, the world was measured in parchment and ink. He was a student at the Sankore Madrasa, a university that had stood for centuries when the New World was still a myth to the kings of Europe. Kalu's fingers were permanently stained with indigo and charcoal. His mentor, an elder with skin like wrinkled mahogany, taught him that knowledge was the only wealth no thief could steal. "The world is tilting, Kalu," the elder whispered, looking at a map drawn on gazelle skin. "To the north, the white kings fight over shadows. To the west, the great water swallows our people. But remember, the stars over the Niger are the same stars that guide the ships in the west. We are connected by the sky." Kalu didn't know then that he would soon follow those stars across an abyss. He spent his days translating ancient Arabic texts on medicine and astronomy, unaware that across the Atlantic, in a place called Virginia, a young George Washington was surveying land, and a man named Thomas Jefferson was beginning to dream of liberty while living in a house built by those who were not free. Chapter 2. The Middle Passage of the Mind. The fall of Kalu's village came not from a foreign army, but from a betrayal of neighbors, fueled by the hunger of coastal traders. The transition from a scholar of Timbuktu to a piece of cargo in the hull of the Thetis was a descent into a living hell. But while the chains bit into his wrists, Kalu did something the slavers could not prevent. He mapped the journey. In his head, he calculated the speed of the ship using the rhythmic thumping of the waves. He tracked the constellations through a tiny grate in the deck. He realized that the Earth was far larger than the scrolls had suggested, but his mind remained his fortress. Among the captives, he became a silent legend. He spoke 3 languages, Bambara, Arabic, and French, and began to learn the English of the sailors by eavesdropping on their drunken arguments about a tax on tea and a king across the sea who was becoming a tyrant. Kalu realized then that the New World was in a state of fever. A revolution was brewing in the land where he was being sent to labor. Chapter 3. The Virginia Frontier, 1774. When the Thetis docked in Yorktown, Virginia, Kalu was sold to a tobacco plantation owner named Silas Holloway. Holloway saw a strong-backed laborer. He did not see the man who could calculate the trajectory of Mars. America in 1774 was a powder keg. In the big house, Kalu heard talk of the Boston Tea Party. In the slave quarters, he heard something else, whispers of the Lord Dunmore's proclamation. The British were promising freedom to any enslaved person who joined the Ethiopian regiment to fight against the American rebels. Kalu stood at a crossroads of history. Should he fight for the Americans, who spoke of all men being created equal while holding him in chains? Or should he fight for the British king, who offered freedom only as a weapon of war? He began to use his literacy in secret. By night, he wrote letters for the other enslaved men, using charcoal on the back of stolen crate slats. He began to forge a network, a bridge of information that stretched from the docks of Norfolk to the hills of Charlottesville. He was no longer just Kalu of Mali.
He was becoming an architect of the American story. Chapter 4. The Forge of Liberty, 1776. The air in Philadelphia was thick with the scent of revolution. As Thomas Jefferson dipped his pen to write the Declaration of Independence, Kalu was working in a blacksmith's shop in Williamsburg, having been leased out by his master. It was here that he met a young Lafayette, the French marquis who had come to support the American cause. Lafayette was struck by the stable hand who corrected his geometry while he was sketching a fortification. "Where did you learn the math of the masters?" Lafayette asked, his eyes wide. Kalu looked him in the eye, a dangerous move for a black man in Virginia. "In my home, Marquis, we were masters of math when your ancestors were still painting their faces blue." This encounter changed everything. Kalu was recruited not as a soldier, but as a spy. His ability to read the terrain, his knowledge of languages, and his invisibility as a slave made him the perfect agent for the Continental Army.
The winter at Valley Forge was not just a test of endurance for the Continental Army, it was the birthplace of American intelligence. While General Washington stared at maps of the frozen Schuylkill River, Kalu moved through the British-occupied camps in Philadelphia. He wasn't carrying a musket, he was carrying a tray of laundry. To the British officers, he was a non-entity, a man who existed only to scrub their linens and pour their wine. They spoke freely in his presence about troop movements in the north and the arrival of Hessian mercenaries. Kalu, utilizing the mnemonic techniques he had mastered as a student in Mali, memorized every name, every regiment number, and every shipment of gunpowder. Late at night, in the shadows of a livery stable, Kalu would translate these mental notes into a complex code. He used a mixture of Arabic script and Bambara symbols, a cipher that no British cryptographer could ever hope to break. These messages were spirited away by the Black Birds, a network of free and enslaved couriers who navigated the swamps and forests that the redcoats feared. One particular dispatch saved the lives of hundreds. Kalu had overheard a British colonel discussing a planned ambush at Barren Hill. He sprinted 12 miles through the brush, his feet bleeding into the snow, to deliver the warning to the Marquis de Lafayette. When the British arrived to spring their trap, the Americans were gone. Lafayette later remarked that his best intelligence came from the most unexpected of philosophers. Chapter 6. The Paradox of the South, 1780 to 1781. As the war shifted to the southern colonies, the landscape became a mirror of Kalu's past. The heat of the Carolinas felt like the edges of the Sahel, and the indigo plantations reminded him of the dyes of his youth. But here, the war was more brutal. It was a civil war within a revolution. Kalu found himself serving alongside James Armistead, another enslaved spy. Together, they navigated a world where liberty was a word used by men who owned them. They shared a quiet, bitter realization. The Americans were fighting for independence from a king, but they were fighting for the very right to exist as human beings. During the siege of Yorktown, Kalu's knowledge of engineering, learned from the ancient masonry of Timbuktu, became vital. He helped the French engineers calculate the angles for the siege trenches, pointing out that the sandy soil of Virginia required a different reinforcement than the clay of Europe. When the British finally surrendered and the world turned upside down to the tune of the fife and drum, Kalu stood on a ridge overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. He saw the British ships leaving, carrying away thousands of black loyalists who had been promised freedom. He also saw the American general celebrating a victory that did not yet include him. Chapter 7. The Freedom of the Pen, 1783 to 1790. The war was over, but Kalu's battle had changed. After the Treaty of Paris, many black soldiers were forced back into servitude.
However, because of the personal intervention of Lafayette and a quiet letter from Washington's camp, Kalu was granted his manumission. He was a free man in a nation that was still deciding what free meant. He moved to Philadelphia, the intellectual heartbeat of the new republic. He changed his name to Kalu Timbuktu, a defiant nod to his origins. He began to work with Benjamin Rush and the early abolitionist societies. His contribution was unique. He didn't just argue for freedom on moral grounds, he argued on intellectual ones. He published a series of anonymous essays titled The Sahelian Perspective, challenging the growing European narrative that Africa was a land without history. He wrote about the libraries of the Songhai Empire, the astronomical charts of the Dogon Empire, and the complex legal codes of the Mali Empire. He became a bridge. He met with Benjamin Banneker, the famous black surveyor and astronomer. Together, they looked at the stars over the Potomac River. Banneker used the latest European instruments, while Kalu used the ancient calculations of his ancestors. They found that their math arrived at the same truth. Chapter 8. The Final Voyage, 1800. By the turn of the century, the Great Experiment of America was growing, and so was the institution of slavery. Kalu, now an elder, realized his story was a rare one. He had lived 3 lives, a scholar in Africa, a slave in the colonies, and a citizen of a new nation. He spent his final years teaching the children of free black families in Philadelphia. He didn't just teach them English, he taught them that their history did not begin in chains on a Virginia dock. He taught them that they were the descendants of architects, poets, and kings. In 1805, on his deathbed, Kalu requested that a small bag of indigo dye be buried with him. It was the color of the Timbuktu sky, the color of the ink that recorded his people's wisdom, and the deep Atlantic that had failed to swallow his soul. The legacy. Today, in the archives of the Amorandian Philosophical Society, there exists a series of unsorted papers featuring strange, elegant script, a mix of Arabic and geometry. Historians often overlook them, but to those who know the story of the Indigo Bridge, they are the proof that the American Revolution was won not just by muskets, but by the stolen genius of a continent that the world tried to forget.